Yeah, so most people know the story of Jonah as the story of a guy getting eaten by a whale, in fact. Although, having said that, the word whale isn't actually mentioned in Jonah at all. So it says big fish, basically. But people have thought, well, if a man gets eaten by a big fish, well, it must be a whale.
Jonah is another book in the Old Testament that comes in the prophets. It's a small book, so if you're flipping too fast, you can miss it, no problem.
Unlike some of the other minor prophets, we do hear about Jonah elsewhere in the Old Testament.
He's referred to in 2 Kings 14:25, just in a passing reference.
According to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, son of Amittai.
Jonah, son of Amittai. And that's the first reference we'll have to him. And then when you get to the book of Jonah itself, it refers to Jonah, son of Amittai.
Well, the interesting thing is that gives us a context for the setting of the biblical book of Jonah. So even if we don't understand it necessarily as a historical book recounting historical events, within the context of the Old Testament narratives, we can set it within the story of Israel, within that context.
Jonah is a fascinating book because he's a prophet, and unlike, say, Jeremiah, who can't even help but do what God tells him to do, Jonah, when he's told to go to a city called Nineveh, which is in ancient Assyria, instead Jonah goes exactly the opposite direction. He hops on a boat. First of all, you don't need a boat to get to Nineveh from where he is.
And he tries to flee from God's presence to Tarshish, which is on the edge of Spain.
Sent this way, goes that way. Why is he doing this? Because he wants to escape from God. But the problem is, how? How do you escape from God?
So he hops on this boat, and he's with a bunch of sailors. All of a sudden, this huge storm starts surging up. Jonah is sleeping. All these men are praying, saying things to other gods, like, help us, whatever. And then they wake him up, like, pray to your God because we've done something wrong.
Jonah is aware that he is responsible for this mighty storm that erupts. He knows that it's his fault, essentially. So he does show a bit of a sense of responsibility here, because he says to the other guys, the only way to stop this storm is for you to chuck me out.
And they say, no, we can't do that. And so they jettison the cargo, everything they can to not throw a person overboard. It's not working. They say, God forgive us. They toss him overboard, and the sea is calm. Meanwhile, Jonah's underwater. A giant fish comes. It says God sends a giant fish. It swallows him up. And Jonah is stuck inside of this fish for 3 days.
And then he suddenly becomes terribly pious. And we suddenly have Hebrew poetry for his prayer, saying, I am cast out from the presence of the Lord, and so on.
And eventually you have this fish vomiting Jonah back up on the shore. And Jonah's like, okay, I'll go to Nineveh.
In the context of the story, it might seem in chapters 1 to 3 that Jonah has fled, perhaps because he's somehow scared. He doesn't want to go to Nineveh to deliver this judgment. It's just a big prospect. Nineveh seen as this oppressive foreign city, and this is another key thing, that it's a foreign nation. In fact, Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, so an enemy of Israel.
So Jonah goes to Nineveh, and it's an enormous city of the Assyrian Empire, and it takes 3 days to walk through. He walks through the whole city saying, repent, God's going to bring destruction, all these things like this. And the people of Nineveh are so struck by this that everybody starts to mourn. They cover themselves with ash and sackcloth, which is a symbol of mourning in the ancient Near East. They even put it on the animals, like how the king, from the king to the lowest servant, everybody repents. And then you get to the point why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh.
What we find in chapter 4 is that it's not that Jonah's scared at all, but rather that he knows exactly what God is going to do, and he's not keen on it, basically. So God, in the end of chapter 3, relents, and he says, I'm not going to destroy Nineveh because they have repented. At the beginning of chapter 4, we see this was very displeasing to Jonah, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said while I was still in my own country? That is, why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing.
Jonah is really angry because it looks as if God is too merciful. And God says to him, well, yeah, that's right, but I'm going to continue being merciful. At the end of the day, Jonah would love, as we all would, for those who are annoying us to get their comeuppance.
Nineveh in Assyria, Assyria is the enemy of Israel, and he doesn't want the Assyrians to be forgiven. He wants this destruction. So you're hoping to delay, or at least the time getting there, by going the opposite direction. Maybe God will do the destruction earlier, or just to get away from his responsibility so that destruction will come. And the way Jonah ends is kind of funny. You get almost this picture of a little kid. God says, do you do well to be angry? And Jonah doesn't answer, he just walks away.
So he's actually angry with God that God will show mercy on Nineveh and not destroy them as he said he would. So that's why initially we find out retrospectively that he fled from the Lord's commands.
Oh, there's a famous, everybody knows about the Sistine Chapel, and it's got all these paintings from Michelangelo, but there's this one small painting, if you can ever get a picture of it, of Jonah laying on his side, and there's a fish next to him as well. The story of Jonah actually became sort of significant for early Christians, and you'll see it even in the New Testament. He's sort of a typology for Jesus.
Jonah was, according to the book of Jonah, 3 days in the belly of the fish, and this is then used like Jesus was 3 days within the bottom of the earth. Jonah came back to a new life, and so Jesus raised to a new life. So this analogy between Jonah and Jesus is quite important.
And then it says that God caused, he sits on this hill and he watches Nineveh, maybe destruction anyway. And it's kind of hot, so it says God causes a plant to grow up over him. He's got this plant over him, it's shading his head, which is nice for some of us with not so much hair. And then the next day, God sends a worm to destroy the plant. The plant is destroyed, there's a hot wind coming, and Jonah is practically dying from heat exhaustion. And he gets so angry, he says, I just wish I could die. And God says, well, do you do well to die? And his response is, or do you do well to be angry? And Jonah says, yes, well enough to die. That's his response. And then it ends sort of just at an odd phase. If I could just give you the closing of Jonah. God says, you are concerned about the bush for which you did not labor, in which you did not grow. It came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left hand, and also many animals? And that's it. You don't get a response from Jonah, many animals, and that's how it ends.